you so much for having me and us. I love talking to Jo for hours on end, so it's nice to do it in this format. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Natasha Lipmann. I am a journalist and a chronic illness blogger, podcaster, soon to be newsletter instead of blogger. And my interest is working with experts and talking about how can we live well with chronic illness and how can we manage that. And Jo has been a really huge part of that for me. So I'm particularly excited to be able to have this conversation today. I know that today's session is really long, so I am keen for us to have at least one mini break. So I suppose we can kind of figure out how that is as we go along. And if anyone has any questions, if you can pop them in the chat, that would be really great. So Jo, who are you?
Hi, I'm Jo. Yeah, I'm also really excited to be here because I am absolutely passionate about talking about pacing. It's like my favourite topic. I am an independent occupational therapist. I work outside of the NHS in private practice. And I basically specialise in teaching people with uncooperative bodies and minds how to cope with whatever it is their bodies and minds throw at them on a daily basis. So I've designed a couple of masterclass type sessions that I built my business around, one of them being pacing. So my aim is to kind of equip everyone I work with the right combination of skills, strategies, equipment and people to just live their life to the best ability with their bodies rather than fighting against them constantly. I also have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, postural tachycardia and some other stuff. So I am somewhat wonky in my own right, got a fair bit of experience in the patient role as well as the professional one. I designed my business to meet my own needs. So the entire thing is done via Microsoft Teams, email and social media. So healthcare role, but with a twist. And yeah, pacing is what I love to talk about.
So I think the thing about pacing is that most people hate it because so many people have been told to do it for years and years and years, but no one is actually told what it is or taught how to do it. Like I remember being given really contradictory information. Like I also have hypermobile EDS back when it was called EDS3, but I was being told to stay as active as possible, but also told to pace and to rest. And I didn't know how to manage those things because I didn't know what pacing meant. And for a lot of people, pacing is very much do an activity, do nothing, do an activity, do nothing. And often it's activity, crash, nothing, big activity, crash, nothing, big activity, crash, nothing. So I think a good place to start is just what actually is pacing.
So this is something I hear constantly and it makes me want to headbutt my desk every single time I work with a new person. Oh, you need to pace yourself, but nobody then follows that up with, and here's how you do it, which would be super helpful, but that's not what you get. So pacing is all about taking challenging tasks or activities or challenging lives and breaking them down from things that are too big and too complicated down to things that are much easier and better management wise. It is all about efficiency. The most efficient way to make use of limited energy is through pacing. I realise that a lot of people get frustrated with the whole do a thing, have a break way of doing things, but actually that's a really simplified view of pacing, and that's often what's taught by people that haven't had to do it themselves. So the way I teach pacing is actually, I started from that point, found it frustrating, hated trying to work out what my baseline activity levels were supposed to be, and realized there must be something better out there, so I invented it myself. But yeah, it is really frustrating to be told to do something, but then nobody tells you how, particularly when you've got advice to do lots of other things from 5 different professionals in 5 different areas. So there's a couple of different strategies that I teach regularly with pacing, which I think we'll probably kind of come on to at various points throughout the session. But the real simple aim is to get to a point where, rather than that boom and bust activity pattern of you doing all of the things followed by a crash to recover, you're able to do mostly the same sort of stuff most of the time. So a lot of people find with chronic conditions, they've got wildly varied amounts of energy or functional capabilities from day to day. And actually, pacing is the start of being able to stabilize that to a point where you know roughly how you'll be able to function most of the time.
So how do we get started with this? Someone comes to you, they say, Jo, I've been told to pace my whole life. I have no idea what it means. I'm booming and busting all over the place. What is step one?
So I normally start by just working through a couple of examples and strategies. So the example I normally give is actually me making lunch. So it used to be that if I was having, chicken salad, whatever, I would prep everything, cook everything all in one go, stood up in the kitchen. Standing up too long starts to make me a little bit dizzy. Then my heart rate starts to creep higher. Chopping things makes my wrists hurt. Then the brain fog kicks in. So when I'm done with the lettuce, I put it in the dishwasher rather than back in the fridge. Or I put a knife down 10 minutes ago and I don't know where it is now. By the time I finally manage to make something resembling a meal, I'm too tired to be hungry and I feel sick from overexerting myself. I would then choke down a meal and spend 3 hours laying on the sofa to recover. And that was what I thought was the only option. You just had to power through and you got on with it. I'm now at the point where I will be a little bit more organized, and planning comes into this a bit more. Organization is important if you're planning on pacing to like a greater degree than just little breaks when you can. I will decide what I'm having first thing in the morning, and when I put the kettle on to make a cup of tea, I might chop up some carrots and just put them back in the fridge and stop. And then I'll go and do a few emails, or I will do a little bit of work in the garden, or even a little bit of physiotherapy, and then I'll chop up the next ingredient, put that in the fridge and stop. Repeating that, by the time I get to lunchtime, all I have to do is assemble everything on a plate and eat it, and then put my plate back in the kitchen, which actually means that I'm less nauseous. I don't feel quite so dizzy or so tired. I don't get that kind of post-meal flop, because digesting food is actually quite a lot of effort. I think that's often vastly underestimated. The basic.
We have fresh. Sorry, I was just going to say, we have fresh bread out of the oven this morning. And I said, I'm not having it until this workshop is done, because I'll be too tired for the workshop if I have to digest the bread for the thing. So I'm pacing when I'm having my bread.
Yeah, so it's sitting there torturing you with its wonderful.
It's literally there. It's, yeah.
It's your motivation to make it through. But yeah, so that kind of breaking it down into little sections allows me to get to the point where actually when you add up all the little bits of time that it takes to do a task, the time is the same. It's not taken me any longer. The difference comes in recovery time. So where I used to have to lay down for 3 hours after lunch, I now have a 20-minute break, and then I can go back to work or go to the garden or do some physio or do whatever it is I need to do. So when you start factoring in recovery time, it becomes much, much more obvious that pacing is the sensible, efficient way to go.
And also, what I found, especially in relation to work, and I think we'll talk about work later, is that if I'm forcing myself through, I actually end up spending more time doing an activity because I'm having to reread the same thing 10 times. I'm having to spend longer trying to make it good. Whereas if I had kind of taken more care with how I had approached the task in the first place, it would have taken the same amount of time it would have taken instead of more time in the long run. So one of the biggest things that I really struggled with, and I've spoken to a lot of people who say this, and I know you've spoken to more people who have said this than me, is that a lot of people still feel like pacing is, okay, you can break activities up, but there still has to be a substantial amount of time where you sit and do nothing in a darkened room. And you taught me that that does not have to be the case. And again, it will really vary depending on people's symptoms and everything, and that there is a place for that. But I can't. It doesn't I can't. And so you taught me kind of about different energy buckets and how to think about energy that way. Could you talk a little bit about that?
But I will just kind of prefix this by, actually, I've got these numbers in my head because I only finished this PowerPoint slide like 2 days ago. The average maximum concentration span for humans before we start to sort of work less efficiently or get distracted or zone out is 20 minutes. That's 20 minutes of concentration for a healthy human without back pain or chronic fatigue or brain fog or a migraine or stomach cramps or anything else. So if after 20 minutes, the average human starts to do less work, starts to concentrate less, starts to produce rubbish quality stuff, I have to think that the concentration for me is going to be considerably lower because I'm distracted by all the symptoms and the symptom management and all the stuff I have to keep in my brain constantly. In an average 8-hour workday, most people will achieve about 3 hours worth of quality work. So those numbers are not great, you know. So pacing is very much about working smarter, not harder. And this efficiency comes in with the first strategy I'm going to talk about today, which is activity alternating. So this is all about swap, don't stop. What I'd like you to have a think about as I go through this are the activities that you do on a fairly regular basis. So I like to break these down into 3 categories. So the first category is the physical stuff. So anything that makes your body work hard, but your brain doesn't have to concentrate too much on. For me, it's things like physiotherapy, gardening, exercise, walking the dog, housework, anything where I have to be stood up for extended periods of time. All of that is quite physical, but brain-wise, not too bad. The second category is the cognitive challenges. So these are things like this session where I can be physically very, very comfortable. I've got my feet up, I'm in bed, it's all good. But brain-wise, I have to do a lot of concentration. I'm dragging stuff out of my short and long-term memory. I'm trying to follow different things on a screen. This is quite a challenge for my brain. So, you know, it is still a challenge, but in a very different way. The final category is then your relaxation type stuff, your recovery activities. So I'm exactly the same as Natasha. I find total rest in a darkened room distracting to the point of it actually giving me symptoms. The tinnitus becomes so irritating that I can't ignore it anymore. The visual snow and static, you know, really starts to irritate me and I can feel myself getting tense. Equally, distraction is a fantastic pain management strategy. So if you live with chronic pain and you remove all distractions, chances are your pain feels worse. That's just how it works. So total rest for people with chronic pain actually is not necessarily productive. Instead, I found things I can do laying down or things I can do that I don't really have to concentrate on. For me, I love reading, so my Kindle has a couple of different books on it. There'll be something academic, there'll be something that's challenging, as in actually designed for my age group and, you know, reading ability. And then I'll have something that's much easier to read, doesn't have too many characters, has a much simpler plot line. And that is where I go for my recovery breaks, to something that isn't a challenge. Likewise, arts and craft wise, I love arts and crafts. I think it's fantastic. I will have a couple of different knitting projects on the go at any one time. One of them will be something where I have to follow a pattern and concentrate and my brain has to work hard. Then I'll have something where I've memorized the pattern already and it's not too difficult. And then I'll have something that I can do laid down, basically with my eyes closed, not having to concentrate at all. That's my recovery activity. Likewise, things like music, I will sometimes listen to instrumental music without lyrics to get distracted by as a recovery activity. So when I finish this session, which is really, really brain heavy and also requires quite a lot of sitting still, the way I recover may be to go and load the dishwasher because it gets me moving, gets my circulation actually circulating. And it's something that's pretty much brainless. I haven't really got to concentrate on it. So swapping between these tasks rather than do a thing, have a rest, means that I'm actually on the go more, but I'm recovering more effectively.
That was actually really a game changer for me. And something that I'd realized over the years was, you know, when you feel really, really awful and you have a day where you kind of can't get out of bed, but then actually, if you can force yourself out of bed even for like a minute, you feel so much better. It's a really weird thing because you're like, I can't get out of bed. And then you get out of bed and you're like, okay, I've moved a little, I'm kind of loosening up, I'm breathing in some air at the window, I'm doing just a tiny thing, even for a really short period of time. And the difference that makes in the kind of the long-term aspect of the day is really substantial. And I think this is all quite hard for people at the beginning, right? Like we're kind of talking about doing these things, but can we maybe talk about how we really start taking these ideas if it is something that is completely new to you. Because I think one of the issues that a lot of people have is that they, I might talk about how I'm really anally pacing everything, but I've been working at this for 4 years. Like, I've been building up with my PT for 4 years. I've been figuring out how to, and I've lived with this stuff my entire life. So somebody who has long COVID, or someone who is relatively newly diagnosed and is jumping into these things, they might look at someone who has been doing it for a long time and think, oh, I should do exactly what they do. But kind of this idea of starting so small, one of the things that you said to me that I basically say to everyone now is, if you've been really fatigued and you've been bedbound, it might be 1 minute of sitting up in bed, and that is your first step, and that's it. So for people who are beginners, how do we start taking some of these broader concepts that we've talked about and start implementing them into our lives in a way that we can build on sustainably?
When I run my pacing masterclasses, one of the last things I say to every single person I teach pacing to is not to be too hard on yourself. This is, when you think about it, what you're starting out doing, learning to pace, is to take every single thing you've learned to do this up to this point in your life and learn to do all of it slightly differently. It's a mission. It's an absolute mission. Anyone who tells you that pacing is easy has clearly never had to do it for more than a day in their entire lives. It is difficult. I have been actively teaching pacing as an OT for 5 years now. I have been actively doing pacing probably since I was 17. I'm now 30. A couple of days ago, I still got it so drastically wrong, I had to spend a day in bed. It's not an easy process. No. It is difficult. But one of the good things about pacing is that you don't have to be perfect at it in order for it to make a difference. If you can pace one thing in your life, and that one thing is making meals, that's a little bit of spare energy. And that's one task in your day that doesn't completely wipe you out to the point of exhaustion. So any progress is good progress, and you should celebrate little victories. But equally recognize that if you've been in one of those really unpleasant, we've all been there, downward spiral situations, reaching a plateau with your health where you're pretty much stable, even if you're not happy with the level you're stable at, that's a win.
Yeah.
Celebrate that. Well done. Fantastic. You've stopped a spiral that the healthcare professionals could not stop. You are winning at life. With regards to pacing, I'm going to probably talk about quite a lot of different strategies, tips, different things. We'll go over stuff that's worked for us. Don't feel like you have to do all of that at once. Pick one thing from today and try it for a month. Or even, 2 weeks. Try it for 2 weeks, see how you feel, and then pick something else and try that. What I don't want anyone to do is to go so all in with pacing that they have to give up everything else in their lives that brings them joy. Because that's not what this is about. We're all here because, chronic. We've been doing this a while, or we're expecting to do this a while. Taking all the joy out of your life is not going to do you any favors from a mental health perspective. So pick one thing, anything from today, and give it a go. And if at any point you need a pep talk about pacing, just tweet one of us and we'll get you back on the wagon.
And I think quite a nice place to start thinking about these things and taking it one really small step at a time is the idea of having a flare up toolbox. Kind of when you're having a particularly bad time and you're having a flare up. One thing over the last few years is I make a really significant distinction between a blip and a flare up, because one day, to me, I know other people are different. One day does not a flare up make, and mentally that is really important because I know that I'm going to have bad days. I've had bad days this week for reasons that would be on my control, but I understood where they came from. So I could prepare for that and I knew what I could do. And so I kind of work on this concept of like a no zero day. So I have a list of things in my head. A lot of people actually like writing the lists. I know that could be very helpful for people. I have a list in my head of all the things I know help me on a day-to-day basis. And I have very many levels of different versions of all of those things that I can do depending on how I'm feeling. So you have a really great example of this in terms of your flare up meal with the soup.
Yeah. So I do have some gastro issues. I am somewhat limited on safe foods. Most of those are cooked from scratch, which is beyond frustrating for somebody who firstly doesn't particularly enjoy cooking and really doesn't have the spare energy for it. So, you know, tomato soup is my fallback. I know I can eat this regardless of how awful I feel kind of food. So we always have tomato soup in the cupboard, and it's stored at waist height, so I can always get it regardless of how bad the back pain is or whether I'm sat down or stood up for the day. I will then take plain tomato soup, and depending on how much spare energy I've got, will make it progressively more exciting and complicated until I've got a meal that meets my needs and, you know, matches up with the activity level. So it may be that I'll just chuck in some dried herbs, or it may be that I'll go down the garden and get fresh herbs, or it may be that I will poach an egg in soup, or have I don't know, grated cheese, or a combination of the above, or some spinach leaves thrown in that I've grown myself. So that's another trip down the garden. It's okay to have like a baseline level of something where you go, I can do this much and I'll do that, and that's fine. And then on bad days, have like a step down, and then on good days, have a couple of steps up. So if you are looking at, as an example, like the self-care stuff, you know, washing, cleaning your teeth, getting dressed, best case scenario might be clean hair, shaved legs, face of makeup, nice clothes, ready to meet the day. Worst case scenario might be wet wipes and a fresh set of pajamas. And then you can scale in between those depending on how you feel from day to day. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense.
Yeah, and it's yeah, it does. And I think it comes back to this idea of understanding what our expectations of ourselves are and kind of being nicer to ourselves. And I hate that. I've been told that my whole life. Be nice to yourself, be kind to yourself. And I was always like, what does that mean? Just, leave me alone. But actually, I think it is just kind of giving yourself a bit of a break to recognize that the nature of having a chronic illness is that it fluctuates, right? And there are things that we can do that can help, but sometimes we could be doing all the things in the world and we still have a flare up because the weather has decided to do 4 seasons in one day, right?
Yeah.
Like it's England, but also it's I think kind of going in with the understanding that that is the deal almost helps you kind of be kinder to yourself because you can then plan for it, if that makes sense.
Definitely. I think pacing is where I always start, and it's the starting point for good self-management is learning to pace. But on kind of meshed in with that, you'll get things like actually starting to pay attention to what your body's telling you. People with chronic pain and chronic fatigue and all kinds of other chronic symptoms get very, very, very good at ignoring everything their bodies tell them, because all of that information is unpleasant and limiting. So we just go, no, I'm not going to think about that. I'm going to push through. I will persevere, ignore and override to the point where your body is eventually screaming at you. And then you either end up in bed for a week or it's blue lights and sirens time. It's very, very difficult to stop doing that, to stop the ignoring and to start listening to your body and working out what it's trying to tell you. But if you can get to the point where you're getting to, say, a little bit of a niggle pain wise, and you go, okay, I'm going to stop. I'm going to swap activities. I'm going to have a fidget break. Great. That's progress over 4 more hours of work, at which point you ended up in bed because you were in so much pain.
So can we talk about little wiggle breaks? Because I think this is another thing that is a very interesting thing. The way I think about it is big pacing, medium pacing, and mini pacing.
Yeah.
And so over the years, I got really good at big pacing in the sense of like, I know I have to leave the house, therefore I'm going to rest before and afterwards. And I kind of got a little bit to grips with medium pacing, but I didn't even think about mini pacing. So can we kind of talk about different levels of pacing?
Absolutely. So the big pacing is I have to go to London for a hospital appointment tomorrow. Today I'm going to do slightly less. In the morning I'm going to look after myself, and I've planned a day off work the next day. That's the big stuff. That's what most people see as pacing, because the big stuff is easier to think about because it's big and loud and obvious. The mini stuff might be actually if you are in London for a hospital appointment, arrive early and then have 5 minutes just sat in the car, scrolling through social media, have a drink, get your bearings, get yourself settled before you then have to tackle the appointment bit where you're poked and prodded. And then you can stop afterwards, write down all the stuff you need to remember, and then travel home. So that's the little bits here and there. But micro breaks, mini breaks are my absolute favorite kind of pacing. And I genuinely think everyone can do these. So in terms of micro breaks, all I'm talking about are like 10 to 30 seconds of not doing the thing you're currently doing. It's really, really easy to do things like, actually, I've got some computer work to get done, so I'm going to jump into my email inbox, I'll press send, and I'll immediately click on the next email, work through that, press send, next email. Now, I've started taking more regular breaks. So whenever I press send on an email now, I will stop, have a little bit of a stretch and fidget, get my shoulders moving, shift my bum around, get my circulation going, wiggle my toes, have a sip of drink, and then go back to work. Now, 10 seconds away from answering emails is negligible. It barely makes any difference to your workload. But what it does do is just keep your body ticking over. So we've probably all been there. And this is something that healthy people do not understand when I use this as an example. That thing where you've been sat down for a couple of hours and you try to get up and it feels like your legs have sort of turned off or gone onto like standby mode, and you have to kind of reconvince your body that getting up is a thing that you can do. It's that sort of thing that can be avoided with micro breaks. But equally, micro breaks give you a really good opportunity to recognize symptom onset. So if you're just pushing through, persevering, I'm going to keep going and going and going, I'm not going to think about all this stuff, you don't notice symptoms until they're at the screaming at you stage. If you're having micro breaks every 15-20 minutes, even more often if you need them, you get to the point where actually in your micro breaks, give yourself a little bit of an MOT. Just work from head to toe and go, okay, have I got neck ache? Have I got headache? Are my arms and legs still attached? Can I still feel my butt? When was the last time I had a drink? Am I overdue for medication? Have I eaten a vegetable in the last 24 hours? All those kind of self-care things that we tend to forget about. Deal with them when you find them. So if you've got a little bit of a niggly headache, 10 minutes away from your computer screen, a drink and a little bit of fresh air will often take the edge off enough for you to go back to work. If you ignore a headache for 4 hours more academic reading or emails or social media or whatever it is you're doing, you're then in painkillers and darkened room territory. And the recovery is that much harder, that much more unpleasant, and that much longer. So the little stuff, cram in as much of that.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, you glitched on my screen. I see that we've got a question from Claire in the chat. I'm going to come to it, but I had another thing I wanted to talk to Jo about, and I know I'm going to forget about it. Speaking of not losing your train of thought from Louise in the chat, so I'm just going to say it now. One of the things that I found particularly interesting is kind of, I kind of took this from like YouTube productivity things, but in the sense of to form habits, in terms of habit formation and kind of path of least resistance, in terms of making your life as easy as possible to do the things that help you. So for example, a really simple thing, having an alarm for when you need to take your medication. Or for me, I schedule things in. If it's a thing that I know is good for me that I just will not do, I put it in my diary and I set alarms to do it. Mostly it's setting alarms to take breaks because of what I do. I could be on a screen all day. And I have this amazing email software that I can batch and tell it when to show me the emails. So I don't have to use self-control to not check my emails. And there's all these kind of little tiny things that you can do that can kind of help you towards the path of least resistance. How can that kind of fit into pacing?
So I think there are two ways to go about pacing. The first one is the kind of regimented, every 15 minutes I will stop for this amount of time approach. A lot of people find that structure really, really helpful. Personally, I find it super distracting if I'm midway through a thought and an alarm goes off telling me to have a break. So what I've done is started forming patterns and habits around repeat activities. So every time I press send on an email, stop and have a break. I don't need to hold any kind of active thought process in my brain then, because I'm moving on to a new project. So that's a good time for me to go, okay, micro break. Equally, the more you practice this, the better you get at fidgeting without, so I don't necessarily have to look away from the screen, but I am getting into the habit of moving my body, having a drink. You'll probably notice me fidget and have drinks and things throughout this session. It's probably quite distracting for you guys, but it helps me with back pain. So those are the kinds of things that work quite well, where you're not actually disrupting whatever it is you're doing. You're using bits of that as a reminder to look after yourself. So hand pain from writing is a really, really common one. At the end of every paragraph, put your pen down and just stretch your hands out straight, make a fist, wiggle your fingers, and then go back to work. That's all it has to be. So you can finish a thought before doing the next kind of break. It's frustrating if you feel like you can't stop because you're going to forget something. So post-it notes are a really great one. I have post-it notes and pens in every single room of the house, all of them, including the bathrooms. Because one of the things I really struggled with from a memory and brain fog perspective was my brain going, you forgot to do a thing, and me going, I'm going to forget what this is if I don't do it now. So I'd come sprinting out of the bathroom and go and sort something in my office, or I'd have to like dash up the stairs or go to the door or run to the car. Now, because there are post-it notes in every room of the house, I write down that thought as soon as I have it. I'll stop, finish whatever it is I'm doing, have a break, and then address the post-it note.
It's actually quite surprising how mentally relieving it is to just write it down. Like, you could be really stressed and worrying about a thing, and then as soon as it's on a list somewhere, if it's on a post-it note, and you'll know you get to it at some point, it just takes it out of your brain instead of being like, oh God, I need to remember these 20 things that I have to do in the next few days. And it's a very kind of mentally relieving thing. And one thing I will say that I've definitely learned is to build flexibility. Like, I'm one of those people that having a form of regimented stuff is very helpful, only because I know that I won't stop because I'm a natural boom and buster. So it's a way to encourage me to stop. However, if on the days, one of the things I have found actually is if I'm having real trouble writing something, I'll put it off. And I'll say, I'm just going to do this for 20 minutes. And the alarm will, and because instead of feeling like, oh God, I have to make this whole thing, I'm like, I can do it for 20 minutes. That's fine. And actually, you'll be putting off your emails for a week, and then suddenly you've responded to most of them in however many short blocks of time, with no other distractions. And so I find that it's helpful in kind of two different ways. But one of the things that I do is that on days where I have a lot that I need to get done, I will schedule in my entire day in the morning or sometimes the night before. But usually by 12 or 1 o'clock, I've completely changed the rest of the afternoon, because it might have been more intellectually stimulating, or someone hasn't shown up to a Zoom meeting, or I've been, whatever has happened, and my short rest breaks need to turn into much longer rest breaks, or I've had to play around with things and kind of just being. So I kind of say I've got like regimented flexibility, and that has been a kind of a better way of balancing it for me, which has been quite helpful. So Claire asked about tips for even bigger pacing, such as days out with the kids. And I know we talked about weddings, for example.
Yeah. Often I think there's a temptation, if you know something's going to be big, for you to go, how much is it going to hurt? How tired am I going to be? How do I get out of it? And you do end up limiting yourself. So I think it's really important to have a go at the big things, but you can modify the way that you do them. So actually, if you try to make something shorter, what happens is, to make it shorter, you take out your rest breaks. So you leave the house at the last minute, rush through whatever the thing is, get the kids bundled up, off you go, and then rush home and crash afterwards. Anticipating the crash, you just assume that's what has to happen. Me and my partner have now got going to the beach down to a fine art, to the point where we unpack the car and it looks like we're camping for the weekend. But what that does is give me base camp where I can lay down, sit down, have my own little portable pharmacy, have a small supermarket's worth of food and drink choices for whatever I feel like. I've got a change of clothes, I've got pillows, I've got chairs, I can lay down, we've got something for shade. What that does is allow me to stay out and enjoy myself, regardless of how uncooperative my body feels. So if I injure myself while I'm out, my first aid kit is probably equivalent to most pharmacies. So I can deal with whatever it is and it doesn't have to ruin my day. So if you are doing like a big day out, as an example, days out with the kids, when you get somewhere, find base camp, find yourself somewhere where you can go and rest. And it may be that that's the car, it may be a park bench, but find yourself somewhere as a safe space for you to go and go, actually, I just need 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes. Have a picnic. If you make pacing your family's normal, it's so much easier to keep going with it, because your entire family, your routine, your life is set up in a way that meets your needs. Nobody ever was made unwell by having too many micro breaks and taking too good care of themselves. These are useful strategies for everyone. I've taught pacing at a corporate level to reduce workplace burnout in offices. It's not just for chronically ill folks, although it tends to help us in more obvious ways. If you've got your entire family trained to take breaks on a regular basis, you all just stop for a drink and a snack whenever you get to a nice view, or whenever you've got 10 minutes, or at the end of every task. Equally, finding ways to make the restful stuff more fun. I play Pokemon Go whenever I leave the house because it gives me an excuse to sit on park benches. Job done. I'm not just sat there recovering, I'm sat there doing a thing. And my partner plays too, so he doesn't mind sitting down for a break because we can both play. So that's the sort of thing that you can use to sort of stealthily give yourself pacing breaks without it feeling like pacing.
And one of the other things that I found, like, for example, I did a recent podcast episode about how to read more with chronic illness, or I talked about language learning with chronic illness. And I think we often talk about pacing specific activities, but I mean, you might disagree with me, but for me, I don't think we can talk about these things in isolation. If I have my life the way it is and I suddenly decide I want to read more, that energy has to come from somewhere, right? So I have to think about everything else that I'm doing in order to say I'm adding in this new activity. If I don't have X amount of energy to spare on this new thing, I have to find the deficit somewhere else. And so we kind of have to almost build this like holistic understanding of how our bodies respond to the things that we do and how we pace things in our lives. So often, as we've already talked about, it's starting really, really small and saying, you know, if you're in bed most of the time, we shouldn't be talking about like, how can you pace a 4-hour workday, right? If you've not worked for a long time, the first thing we might do is say, can you get some fresh air at your window for a very short period of time, and we can build it up from there. And so when we're talking about an activity like reading or anything that is cognitive or physical, we have to take that into consideration with everything else that we're doing in our lives. And I will just say, especially if you're new to this, one, learning to notice yourself is a skill that we are not taught. And some people are naturally better at it than others, that's fine. But it is a skill that you can learn to be aware of how you feel, what you're doing, how you're reacting to things. And over time, it will become really natural to you. So, but it's almost like the pre-step to kind of be able to then have a more holistic understanding. And that's where, for a lot of people, for example, if they have a flare up, they literally have a list on their wall or in a drawer of all different things that they can do at different levels, so they can pull it out and they don't have to think about it. Thoughts?
The longer I work with you, the more you sound like an occupational therapist. No, it's brilliant. I completely agree. I think it's one of the things that I don't want to kind of tar everyone with the same brush, but healthy healthcare professionals have no idea how much work goes into being healthy if you don't have healthy as a starting point. So this is one of the major problems, particularly with fatigue as a symptom, when healthcare professionals go, well, if you just do this, you'd feel better. But the this they're suggesting is massive. Like if you could just eat nothing but fresh fruit and veg, You know, how do I get to the shops? How do I prepare it? I can't even open the packet half the time. I can't lift a saucepan. You know, it's having that awareness of the fact that energy has to come from somewhere is part of the reason why I always teach pacing first. Because regardless of what information I give somebody, regardless of how important it is, they have to work that into their routine somehow, which means energy has to come from somewhere. Unless we're creating energy or making better use of energy with pacing, what I'm asking somebody to do is to give something else up for the greater good of feeling better.
Otherwise, you're going against the laws of physics.
Yeah.
I have a physicist next to me. Can you create energy? No, he's shaking his head. You can't just create it out of nothing. And I think Louise popped that in the chat too. Yep. The law of conservation of energy states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only converted from one form of energy to the other.
Yep.
To another.
So, with, you know, pacing doesn't give, it feels like it gives you more energy, but what we're actually doing is just being more efficient about your old energy usage. So if you think of that in terms of electricity, the more efficient your devices are, the lower your bills are. Simple as. If you're heating a house, the better your insulation is, the warmer it feels. But that doesn't mean more heat's created. It just means that you're making better use of it. So I think, you know, pace the pacing. Don't feel like if you are given advice from 8 different healthcare professionals, you know, and they've all wanted you to do some form of health homework, how? You know, it's okay to go back to a healthcare professional and say, I don't have the energy for this thing that you want me to do. How do I make it easier? It is never on the patient if healthcare does not work out for them for health reasons. It is on the professional. It is my job to give advice that meets the needs of my clients. If I recommend to all of my chronic fatigue cases and all my long COVID cases to start running marathons so that they feel better, and none of them manage it, that's my fault, not theirs. It's on me. So if any of you have vast amounts of healthcare homework from 20 different departments and you're not getting all of it done during one day or 1 week or 1 month, it's not your fault, it's theirs. You know, it's on them to create a routine for you that works. Your job is to communicate when it doesn't.
And I think it comes back to this thing that, I mean, even, you know, I talk to my friends with no health issues about this when it comes to talking to their bosses if they're overloaded. It's saying, how do I prioritize? And there are always going to be things in our lives that we have no control over that, you know, I don't have kids, for example, so I don't have to think about using energy on looking after kids or anything like that. There are things that we need to do and there are things that we want to do. And it's figuring out how to kind of prioritize all of those things in the most, as you said, time efficient way. My best friend says it's like we live life on hard mode. And it's learning the cheat codes almost to be able to hack it or whatever we want to call it. And it's and I think that has been the biggest thing for me is I am like ruthlessly efficient. Like I get angry at inefficiency, or like I will say like almost to the point where sometimes I'll be like, okay, we've repeated this now 10 times. Like I get it. Like it's it's constantly, and I think it is, again, and you become more natural at it. It's making those calculations in your head about where you're taking energy from for every activity that you're doing. But I do think it becomes more natural over time. And it is just giving yourself the opportunity to build it up really, really slowly, which is really important. I think there was something that Louise asked before. I'm just going back to micro breaks. Any tips for not losing your train of thought with micro breaks? I struggle doing cognitive work due to brain fog. It takes me ages to figure out what I'm doing and get worried to take breaks because it takes me ages to get back to where I was.
I mean, that's often an indication that you're taking breaks too late. So if you're at the point where brain fog is already disrupting your work, it's because you've gone too far down the doing things line before taking a break. And it seems really ridiculous to, like, as an example, when I do appointments with clients, I've got a 30-minute pre-appointment alarm. When that goes off, I'll come upstairs, open all the right paperwork, open the call, like the video chat call ready, get a drink ready, and then stop and have a break. So I'm prepared for an appointment and then I have a rest. And then I have the appointment and then I have a rest, or I do something else. And then I'll write notes up. So actually, if you can break things down, it may require breaking down to the point where the prep work is done, and then you have a break, and then you start the task, and then you have a break. So if you're getting to the point where you kind of can't concentrate and can't keep going, often it's because you're already kind of down the burnout road before you've got to the point where you think you need to take a break. So more micro breaks. Equally, if you work is one of those difficult ones where quite often you just have to get stuff done because of deadlines or because of other things. If you can't pace a certain task to the extent that you would want to, have a look at what you can pace better in the rest of your life. Often, well, a lot of us have a lot more control over things like our home lives, housework, personal care, all that kind of stuff. See what else you can move around so that you're less exhausted when you're trying to do the paperwork, complicated stuff.
And also, I think some of it is thinking about when you work best, if you have the luxury to be able to kind of set your own schedule, thinking about times of the day when you kind of function better. And one of the things, just on that last point that you made, I work with Kim, who you know very, very well. And she taught me about like this concept of the stress bucket and I kind of use it in relation to flare-ups as well. So, if my stress, I literally say this to myself now, it's like, I have no control over this thing that is happening. So I have to be more mindful of all of the other things to kind of keep my stress bucket level here instead of like tipping over. Yeah. So even if it's not a work related thing, it's like, do I need to up my self-care? Do I need to like do more breathing exercise because that helps me? Do I have to make sure I have my baths? Do I have to kind of pay real attention to those other things to enable me to do the really hard things? But also I know, and I'm very fortunate, I can't cook if I want to work. I can't do it. I have these like shake things that I have in the morning. I have it with a frozen fruit and the shake, and it's got me everything I need for that meal. It keeps me full. It's got protein. Sorted. I do not have the mental space for these things. And so it's also kind of thinking about those other things where you have the ability to do that. I know that not everyone has someone that loves to cook. Thank you.
I'm totally the same. Yeah, I live off, meal in a bottle, job done, off we go. Yeah, I think, but it's not just you. Human beings don't live in isolation. We're all part of a community and a network, whether that's an immediate family group, or whether that's you and your doctors, or whether that's you and your friends, or just you and the wider community. None of us are completely isolated from the rest of the world. So things that happen bigger picture outside of us still have an impact. So that stress bucket, where when you're adding stressful things and your borderline stress levels start to rise a little bit, you may be more prone to flare-ups. Your flare-ups might be worse. You may, find that certain symptoms that are more impacted by stress are worse. So migraines, headaches, gastrointestinal complications, stress tends to have a massive impact on those. And then recognize other big stresses in your life. Every single time you've turned on the news for the last, 12, 14, 15, however many months COVID's been going on, you get a daily dose of bonus stress on top of the rest of your life.
And just living with pain is stressful. Like Kim had to constantly remind me of this. She's like, your stress bucket's already going to be more full because you're in pain every day. Like we often, because something is our normal, we discount the impact that it has on these other things because we're trying to just deal with it.
Just because something is your normal does not mean it doesn't have an impact on you. Totally.
So tips, read the meals, micro breaks. Oh gosh, yes, that does sound very tough, Claire. Something I just wanted to flag on what Louise said earlier. I think if you do kind of work from home in kind of the more, like writing, social media, any of these kinds of fields, it's very easy to feel dependent on like a flow mentality, that you kind of make the most of what you've got and you kind of push yourself while you're in a kind of positive state. I have trained myself to be able to say, I can do this for a short period of time. I can make a really quick note about what I was thinking and I can step away and come back to it and I can kind of get back into that state. And so I think I was very, very dependent. In a job that I had years ago, I mostly worked from home and I had to go into the office once a week. I was like, if you do not schedule me back to back, I will crash if I take breaks. But it meant that I was back to back with a 1 hour minimum each way travel on top of that, which now I know probably not the best. But I think it's finding a balance between finding ways to kind of teach yourself to get back into like work mode, and what that is different for everyone, and as you said, stopping before it gets bad. And you even, like, we talked about this in terms of any activity, right? Like if you're knitting, for example, and your hands start hurting, the aim is to, like, before your hands hurt so much that you can't knit for a week, you need to stop. And that's learning what your pre-symptoms are. So one of my best friends, he was like, I just suddenly go from okay to not okay. I was like, let's interrogate this a little bit. And I know for me, I get really hot. Like I get hot, I talk more than normal, I get a bit jittery. These are signs that I'm starting to push, and kind of learning to kind of wind that back and be aware of what your bad thing happening signs are, is really helpful.
Totally, yeah. For me, one of mine is a clear indication that I need a break is my typing gets less accurate. So if I'm looking at a paragraph I've just written and it's mostly red squiggly lines, I know that I'm pushing my limits and I really should have taken a break already, and then I'll take a break. But yeah, it is the prioritizing and pacing. This again comes back to the fact that pacing does not stand alone. It's part of a toolkit. It's part of a series of things that are useful. So, you know, using the work side of things as an example, if you need to keep going, if you need to work, if you are brain wise on a really, really great kind of on a roll, the flow is fantastic and you don't want to stop, but your arms hurt, get yourself voice dictation software and a hands-free headset, and then you can wander around your office and talk and your computer types for you. So sometimes it's that combination impact of actually strategies that I implement on my own body, things that I do in my routine, plus equipment, plus modifying environment, plus everything else.
And that's also something, it brings up something that I think is really important and very underrated. We talk about pacing in a way of saying we want to reduce the negative impact of symptoms. However, there are also things that we might want to do in our lives that are going to cause us symptoms, no matter how well we pace it, no matter what we do, no matter how hard we try. There are things that we might want to do that are going to kind of not be great for a short period of time. But one of the things that you talk about is that when you kind of get into the habit of pacing, you can make those things a decision instead of kind of flailing around from thing to thing. The flailing is my word. That I don't think you're far too professional to say that. But it's, but I think having that idea of making something a conscious decision and knowing that we're allowed to do things that we enjoy, and we shouldn't have to stop doing things that we enjoy just because we might feel a bit worse for doing them. So how do you usually approach that with your clients?
So I always talk about prioritizing things, because actually it's very easy to get down to how much is it going to hurt, how tired am I going to be, and those are the only things you consider when you're making decisions. So I normally use an example. Feel free to answer in the comments here. If I asked any of you to run a marathon tomorrow, would it be worth it? Would anyone join in? No. Yeah. See, no is the correct answer, because there are no benefits to you guys running a marathon with no training and no prep during a pandemic. It's a ridiculous thing for me to suggest. However, if I suggested doing a COVID secure marathon, but some lycra-clad fitness enthusiast CrossFit type would push you in a wheelchair the entire way to the finish line, and when you cross the finish line, you got £1 million in cash and a cleaner and cook for the rest of your life, would it be worth considering? Yeah, exactly. So, right, tempting. The task has not changed. The task is to complete a marathon. What's changed is how we do it and what the risk reward analysis is. So physically, we've modified the task, but from a bigger picture, wider thinking kind of thing, what we're thinking is actually long term, would this radically improve my life? So actually, if you've got something, healthcare is often a good example. Things like physiotherapy, short term, generally don't feel great. Whenever I start a new physiotherapy routine or a new bit for a new wonky bit of my body, I assume it's going to cause me extra pain in the short term. But it's worth it because in the long term, my physical function improves and I have less pain and less inflammation and I'm more mobile. So sometimes
this can even be for, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
But this can even be for things that we think won't cause us problems. So for example, I got compression gloves to help with pain in my hands and blood moving around my body. I felt so physically sick. I had them on for a while and I thought I was going to throw up. I felt awful. And then I talked to a physio friend of mine. She's like, yeah, your body's so reactive to things. You probably need to pace your body getting used to compression gloves. So even these things that we think are potentially going to help us with these things, we also have to kind of bear in mind how we use them and build them up if you are kind of reactive to them.
Yeah, totally. I think like orthotics for shoes are a good example. Often it's like try them for an hour a day and then build up. I always recommend for hypermobile people, whatever you're recommended to do, if you're recommended it by somebody who isn't a specialist in hypermobility, you do half as much for half as long, like half the intensity and half the duration for whatever it is you're being advised to do, and build up from there. I think it's so easy to underestimate the impact things can have on your body. But equally, with the kind of prioritization kind of stuff, sometimes you just need to do something that brings you joy or fun or is really important, at which point the planning side of things comes in as much as the pacing does. So yes, the big pacing, when you look at a task and you go, okay, I'm going out for an entire day with 5 friends to a place where I can't get safe food and I'm going to eat all the stuff that poisons me a bit, but it'll be delicious, so I don't mind. Fine. But how do you plan for afterwards? Have you laid your outfit out in advance the day before? The next day, have you cancelled absolutely everything so that you can stay in bed for an extra couple of hours and then spend a couple of hours getting going? Have you got your meals ready for the next few days? So actually, if you're doing the big thing that's fun and exciting or really important, although that thing isn't paceable, you can plan around it. You can be aware of what the rest of your life is going to look like. And actually, when you look at the priorities and that risk reward analysis, if I was looking at actually best friend's wedding, fantastic, it's going to be amazing. But the day before something slightly important comes up, would I still do it knowing that the next day I've got the big thing? Maybe not. Whereas if I had nothing planned for the next 2 days, I would. So you can't look at one task in isolation. You have to look at your entire life. But getting the hang of pacing does not mean you aren't allowed to overdo it ever again. I do so on a regular basis. I've just taken on part of an allotment. You know, I am quite regularly doing slightly too much, but I've planned my life and modified my life in such a way that I can work from bed. You know, so I've got my bed for sleeping and then I've got my office bed. So all of my paperwork is done. Profiling bed, angle adjustable desk on wheels that moves with me. What happens when you get your toolkit and your strategies set up is that things that used to be incredibly disabling and ridiculously disruptive become less so. So my health has been fairly well plateaued for about the last 10 years. I have a couple of quite chronic things that flare up and calm down again. I've had blips, you know, a bad migraine will wreck me for a few days. But generally speaking, I've been roughly as functional for about 10 years as I have been at any other point. In the last 5 years, I've stepped up my working hours, started taking on more international work, started guest lecturing at 3 different universities, started having student occupational therapists follow me around. I've taken up Viking reenactment. I've started co-running a hedgehog rehabilitation group. I'm doing all of the things that I want to do with my life, but I'm not better. I still have chronic fatigue. My POTS is still ridiculous. I still dislocate joints on a daily basis. But I've modified my life so that those things don't ruin my ability to engage. And that is what I want for everyone. That's the start of when the toolkit starts to become really effective. And it may cost you thousands of pounds in equipment, years of your life spent researching and tweaking and trying things. But the end result is worth it because it means you can engage with your life again, despite the fact that you're still ill and you're still tired and things still hurt.
And I think this is, we did a podcast together for my work where we spoke to someone who had long COVID, so was very new to kind of fatigue. And I suppose one of the biggest messages that you say is that being ill doesn't mean you can't live a happy, fulfilling life. And I think there is a mindset shift that comes with it. And it's difficult to say that because I think the mindset shift also comes when you see things starting to work. It's really hard to kind of get there first. It's like a chicken and egg situation that I had when I started kind of exercising to build up strength. It was, I would say 50% of what we did was me feeling safe in my body. And I was able to do more as I was able to prove to myself that I could do things. So it is a chicken and egg situation, but it's a really I went on like a Twitter rant after my first session with you because I was so frustrated that there's so many quite basic things that I feel that people need to be told about having a long-term condition, but how to live with it is never talked about. At least it never was for me. Anything in terms of actually having a fulfilling and happy life was never taken into consideration. Any kind of things to do with mental health was, oh, you're depressed. It's like, yeah, well, I'm ill. So it was always talked about in relation to my health, but not in relation to how my health had impacted my life. And I was never given the opportunity to think about anything apart from take this medication or do these exercises, and nothing else seemed to matter. And I feel like the entire conversation around, you know, how many people live with these long-term conditions and you can have a very fulfilled life. If I think if people knew that going in and had the opportunity to learn how to manage things as well as possible, because the reality of a lot of these conditions are that there's only so much that the doctors can do, right? And that's a really hard lesson to learn. But at some point, for a lot of conditions, you deserve to get everything that you deserve to get from the doctor. But then there's a point where it's kind of on you in terms of you have to manage as best as you can. And most people are not given the tools and the support to be able to do that. And that makes me so angry because I think so many people end up suffering way more than they need to. And I remember this quote from Professor Graham, who was a kind of a lead EDS doctor. He said, EDS does not have to become anywhere near as debilitating as it has been. It's that people have been neglected. This is not a verbatim quote. So, but people have been neglected and people have been let down. And I saw that for myself. Like the last 4 years, I've been undoing the neglect. And it's just really frustrating. So it's how do we kind of change these things so that people are given the support early on? that's the hardest thing.
This is a huge frustration for me, both as a patient and as a professional. So some of the people I work with are undiagnosed, but it's generally accepted there's something going on, but medicine doesn't know what it is, so they can't fix it. And yet they've been going through a diagnostic journey that's 10 or 11 years old. At no point have they ever been referred to an occupational therapist for things like getting out of the bath or being able to make a meal safely or going into their workplace without injury. This is why I love my job so much, because it's not dependent on me going, I can fix you. Or if you take this pill, you'll get better. You don't have to be better in order to be happier. What you need is support that makes your life accessible again. And I think for a lot of people who have been down the very medicalized path with their health journey, it is beyond frustrating to just be a giant set of symptoms that nobody fully understands without hope for a cure. Healthcare is very much aimed at fixing people. And when your doctors can't fix you, they kind of look at you like, well, I can't solve this. I don't know what to do with you. Good luck. Stop booking appointments with me because you're making me sad, but I can't do my job. It is frustrating, you know, and I think this is why I'm kind of grateful for my own life experiences, because I think it makes me a better therapist, knowing what it's like to be faced with, I can't fix you, but I also don't know what to do with you. I vowed to myself that I'd never be the person sat on the professional side of the table going, I don't know what to do with you. That was my promise to myself and to all of my clients when I set up shop. And so far, so far, so good. But yeah, it does require a certain amount of acceptance, but acceptance only tends to happen when you've sat with it and felt the feelings and dealt with your emotions and processed the change in your life. I think too much of the chronic illness experience is giving up things and losing things. And one of the things I love about being an occupational therapist is being able to give people something in exchange. So my career before my first grand health crash was in outdoor adventure. I taught rock climbing for a living. I worked in outdoor adventure stuff, lived in the woods while I was at work, worked 40-foot up trees on little wooden platforms, did zip wires and team building and all that stuff. And then got my first wheelchair a month after my 21st birthday, and I could just see my hopes and dreams for my life dissolving. As equally, I recognized that actually this made my life considerably easier. But it was at that point that I was just like, you know, I just can't, what I planned for my life disappeared completely over the course of about a year. And it was gut-wrenching and soul-destroying and awful. But the start of me being happy again was me getting stuff to replace the things that I'd lost. So yes, rock climbing became a serious challenge and a massive health risk. But for the first time in my life, it meant that my nails were long enough to actually look okay with nail varnish on. So during the first 6 months of my mostly housebound kind of bed nest, can't really function, constantly injured phase, I taught myself nail art based off YouTube tutorials. And it's still my fallback. I feel rubbish, I need some extra self-care activity, is to prop myself up in bed with 20 different nail varnish colours and over the course of 4 hours of TV, create some kind of artwork manicure. That's my fallback, because it reminds me that I've got stuff back in my life rather than just losing things constantly. So my partner and I met at a gymnastics session, adult gymnastics session. We did parkour and dance together. I performed at the Royal Albert Hall in front of 7,000 people with a modified costume to cover all the tape and splints and braces, and was back on crutches and got carried back to the dressing room because I was so badly injured afterwards, but I did it. But when I couldn't do that anymore, I felt like I'd lost everything, like my hobbies, my interests, the friendship circle that I'd built that around, gone. So instead I became their photographer. So I still got to hang out with the group and I still got to see the people, but I could do that sat down and was considerably less broken at the end of each performance. So I was still part of the community and still got to do something. The photography then led to bird watching, and then bird watching led to gardening, and then the gardening led to, you know, plant dyes and organic food and allotment stuff. So getting occupation back, and by occupation I don't mean work, I mean something, some kind of doing, getting that back in your life is a real turning point for a lot of people when they realize that it isn't just one long downhill slope. There are ways and means to modify. You know, I've got a lot of different hobbies that are my fallback hobbies for when I'm back on bed rest or when I'm back stuck in the house more. And then I've got my going out hobbies. And then I've got the kind of crossover where actually, like with Viking reenactment groups, if I can't physically get to a meeting, sometimes I'll just Facebook Messenger video call them while they're at training, say hi to everyone, and then go back to sleep. You know, so it's about giving yourself options and working out how and why and what brings you joy and finding things for you to do, because there are very, very few situations. In fact, I've not actually come across any, and I've worked with some really severely disabled people where nothing is the only option. You know, there's find something that brings you joy. Drop me a message and I'll help you work out how to make it a reality. You know, because it is something I'm hugely passionate about. I think it's a turning point.
I don't remember if you said this to me or if someone else did, but this idea that, like, even for the most severely disabled people, this idea that there is always something is more often a failure again of their doctors or of the people that are supposed to be supporting them, because they're asking them to do something that is too high, or they're not able to help them adapt something, even if it has to, it's going back to that, like, sitting up in bed for a few seconds as a starting point, and kind of having these kind of learning how to build things up from really, really small bits, and really focusing on what is it that you're really passionate about and how can you adapt that. And I think the creativity that it takes to have a chronic illness is very underrated. And I have to say, and I know this will not work for most people, but this is what I grew up with, so I appreciate it. I had a 24-hour rule in my house when things kind of got quite bad, where I had a period of time to feel my feelings. And then I had to kind of think of like one tiny thing that I could do to kind of adapt or adjust, or kind of think about different ways of doing things. And I think, there was that. And then the other thing that I was thinking about is we often kind of can get into very black and white thinking about our health, in the sense that even if you do have significant decline, and I've been there and I've got into very dark places with it, we can still have moments of joy in really like the worst days. And I think this idea, like, our health is never stable. Like, it's never stable, but it's never static, right? Like, it will change. Even if things are getting worse, like, you still will have better days in comparison to those days. And it does go up and down, and kind of understanding the nature of that, I think, can sometimes help. That it can feel like the bad can last forever, but when you do have maybe those small things of something that you love, it gives you something to hold on to and something to aim for. And as you said, you know, you aren't going to go back to rock climbing, but you found ways to adapt and to be part of different things that you love. But also, I think it's worth remembering, even healthy people change what they love. Like, we you know, something that you love when you're 18, you might hate by the time you're 30. That our interests change, the way we approach life changes, and that's the nature of life. I think it's so exaggerated for people with chronic illness, because we have to go through so much grief and so much loss. Matt has asked, just on that, how do you cope with the grief of being adjacent to the things you used to be able to love doing?
I try not to cope with it in the way that it sounds like it's managed. It isn't. I feel it. I'll cry about it and rant about it and scream about it and have a temper tantrum and ugly cry all over the people that I used to go training with. You're allowed to do that. You're allowed to be upset and angry and frustrated, particularly for those of us who maybe, if the support had been there at the first place, that could have been avoided, entirely avoided. There are a lot of healthcare decisions that, knowing my diagnosis now and knowing how things would have progressed, if my healthcare had been different, my life would be radically different right now. You're allowed to be angry about that. You can rant and scream and cry and make complaints and start a blog just to get your feelings out there and do whatever it is you need to do. But at some point, what starts to happen, whether deliberately or unconsciously, is that you start to find that actually you're not quite so angry about it anymore. You know, and it's that whole like time heals all wounds thing. It doesn't, but it does get a little bit easier to live with. You know, you can start to manage things, and when you start finding meaning and joy in other stuff, that like void in your soul that used to be filled with that one activity, maybe something else just nudges in there and you start to find joy somewhere else in your life. But you are allowed to grieve for it. It's sensible. You should grieve for it. The more you bottle these things up, they have to be dealt with at some point. At university, we did a lot of like life stage theory in preparation for our first placements. And it talks about the sorts of experiences you find at different life stages, and it breaks it down to like in your early 20s, you start to learn to be an adult, and you start that kind of nurturing phase of your life, and then you move on to having families, whether that's like a biological child or whether that's creating like a friendship group or a pet or the act of nurturing a career. And then as we get older, we start to kind of recognize that bodily decline is a thing that we have no control over. You go through the phases of starting to give stuff up or find new hobbies or modify. You come to terms with the fact that your body is not as great as it once was. The difference is that that's supposed to happen when you're in your 70s and 80s. So that's supposed to happen when you've had all the experiences you wanted to have.
I snapped at a family friend about this, and he's like the nicest man ever, and I think he was like in his 70s, and he has Parkinson's, which is way worse than what I've got, but he got Parkinson's when he was much older. And I think he was just saying something empathetic. I was having a really bad day. I was like, but you still got to have a life. I was a teenager, right? And I think there is so much grief tied into that. And I think one of the things that you were talking about when you started talking about grief is being able to express that. And I see this, it's very interesting on social media. I see this in two ways. One, I've had a lot of messages from people saying, I feel really bad because I'm really upset that I need to use a mobility aid, and I know that's just internalized ableism. And I say to them, you are grieving losing mobility. There is nothing, like, I can say at this point that using a wheelchair or using a mobility aid is freedom giving to me. However, at the beginning, hell no, it wasn't. And especially if, you know, you lose your health suddenly, or if you've been very healthy and very active, and then you have to lose those things that have been so fundamental to your identity, that grief is always going to come before something that is freedom for somebody else. And I'm very passionate about that, because I feel like people are being told that the way they're feeling is wrong, and that it makes them bad disabled people. And I just want to say it absolutely does not, because if you have lost something, you are more than entitled to grieve it. And the other thing is just on communication. So, for example, we had friends visiting from abroad, and then, you know, they all went to Cambridge for the day and I couldn't go. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to be honest. I'm really jealous and I'm really upset that I can't come. And this has nothing to do with you. It's not your fault. I'm not angry at any of you. I feel a bit shit about this. And it's something that, like, my friends know. I vocalize these things, and it's never about them, and I don't blame them, and I don't get angry with them unless they're really late constantly, and then I get annoyed. But apart from that, it's you know, I think it's healthy to not just pretend that I'm okay with it. And by being able to have honest conversations with the people closest to me, I can almost prevent a growing bitterness, because I have a lot of people who have messaged me over the years that say, people don't understand me, people, I'm not getting the support that I need. And I would say 95% of the time when I've said, have you told people what you need and how you feel? They say no, they should just know. And people don't know what's in your head. People don't know how these things affect you. And I think being able to build kind of healthy communication, and I know with some people and with some relationships that's not possible, and you have to be in a place where it's safe to do that. But as much as possible, kind of learning to communicate. For example, we can tie this back to pacing, right? Or I help a lot of people do this in the workplace. I talk about how I need to work so that I can do the best job that I can do, or how I can be the best friend that I can be. And this is kind of my deal. And this is, if you want me, this is kind of what you get. And I'll do everything to play my role, but my role might look different. And I know we've talked about this before, so I can't really cook. You know, I might do a bit at the weekend, but I'll get some help, and that'll be my big weekend activity. But I do our admin, because, and I know you're the same with this, like, admin is so easy for me. I love admin. I love it. And so for me, that isn't something that is super energy intensive, and I can play a role in my relationship. I can do these things. But I'm not having to do the things that I can't do. And we've discussed these things. And even in relationships where both people are healthy, you don't take activities and split them 50-50. That's not how the world works.
Completely.
And so I think it's being able to have conversations about what you can bring and how you can feel. And I think especially in relationships of any kind, when you can't physically do things, you feel very insecure about yourself and your role in the relationship. And I'm still a little bit insecure from when I was much more unwell than I am now. But I think it's recognizing that doing things isn't necessarily what makes you important, right? I tend to find that my friends with health issues are like the most loving, caring people who are there for people. Or like I realize I like buying presents for people, like tiny presents. I'm a great present giver. And I realize it's because I couldn't necessarily be there, or I wanted to thank people for being there for me. And there's all kinds of, I think we just have to kind of reformulate how we think about our role in relationships and in all of these excuse me, things that we do. And to me, that all ties into pacing, because as you said, we don't live in a vacuum. So the way that we interact with others really plays a huge role in this. Like my friends constantly tell me off for like doing too much. That's really important to me. That's really important for me. I respond well to being told off by my friends. And yeah, I'm blabbering now, so please.
Yeah, I think totally there's a lot to be said for kind of, I think my friend Tanya summed it up perfectly. Sorry about that, my email making weird noises. There's something to be said for relationships. A relationship isn't each person doing an equal percentage of the workload. It's each person doing 100% of what they can. And if 100% of what you can is not 50% of the workload, so be it. Not a problem. Nobody is forcing your partner to pick up the slack. They do it because they love you, or not, in which case find a new relationship. And I know it's not as simple as that, really, but it's very, very difficult to see value in the things that come easily to you. So like you with the admin, I'm a problem solver. I can look at 20 different tasks and I can see an efficient way to do them, or I can make them possible for somebody who didn't think they were possible, or I can just make it easier in some way. My brain looks at things like that and goes, have you tried this? And the other person goes, I had no idea that was an option, and it's better. That's what I'm good at. What I'm bad at is anything that involves physical labor, anything that involves long-term memory, anything that involves money, because I'm terrible with numbers. Cooking, not good at that. Cleaning toilets, not good. Bed sheets, can't do those either.
Oh my God. By the way, there's this company in France that has built this thing that you attach to the door. I think I'd be too short for it, but some people attach it to a headboard, and it basically like you clip the sheets and the thing onto it, and it like helps you put the sheets on. They don't deliver to the UK, but it's like we will talk about these kinds of things later. Sorry, please continue.
Yeah, no, it's just saying, like, just because something comes easily or naturally to you does not mean that other people don't value it as a skill. So my partner, he's quite said on a regular basis that like I'm the brains of the operation and he's the brawn, because he's fine with heavy lifting and scrubbing and following instructions, but his brain does not solve problems well. It's just not what his brain is built for. So that's my role in the household. And often one of the things that can be a problem is when you've got kind of societal norms, gender norms, like preconceived roles and ideas about what we should be doing. If they don't work for you, really honestly have a think about whether it's worth it or not, whether it's worth trying to persevere with the traditional household roles or gender roles or whatever, or whether your life would be better if you just threw it all out and then wrote a list of things you were good at and things you were bad at. My partner doesn't mind cooking. I love growing food. So although it's more manual labor, it comes more naturally to my skill set. So I spend more time in the garden than I do in the kitchen. DIY comes naturally to me because of the problem solving brain and because my dad was an engineer. So any DIY in the
Mine
house,
too.
we match. But yeah, my partner, he's great with money. He's great with organizational stuff. He can cook, he can do heavy lifting. probably wouldn't know which way around a drill went until I told him. So DIY is my thing. So, he can cook and clean the kitchen, and I'll grow food and put shelves up. It's work out what works for your body. And if it works for you, then it's the right option.
So here's a question then. I think we're both in very fortunate positions where we've kind of got very supportive partners, and we've got I would say we have a completely balanced relationship, but it just doesn't mean that we're doing 50-50 of exactly the same things. How do people start thinking about communicating? Because I think this is, at the heart of everything. I think when you're dealing with other people is knowing how to approach communication, especially how to communicate about your health, because I think there is a trick to it. What advice would you give to people who kind of struggle with communication, and how to start being able to talk about these things?
So the first thing I'd like everyone to do is to write a list of every single symptom they're currently dealing with and just sit with it and look at it for a minute. Recognize all of the things that might conceivably need communicating about. Just look at them, understand them, and then write a giant list of all the stuff that you have to do on a daily basis that keeps you at least mostly well. And the final part of this exercise is to think about what would happen if you stopped doing all of list number 2. For most of us, it would not be a pretty picture. Yeah. Some of us, it might be fatal. But when you're thinking about, I'm not living up to this, I can't do that, I'm not doing, pulling my weight, look at those lists and recognize that your first and foremost full-time job is being healthy. That's something that comes naturally to my partner. He can not have to think about that to the extent that I do. So he's got more spare energy for cleaning the kitchen. If I want to be well enough to be the problem solver, I have to do this enormous list of healthcare rubbish first. That's my job. So when I'm talking about my actual job, I have modified that, or had to modify that, in ways that allow me to focus on my first job, which is being healthy. So there is something called reciprocity. And it's normally talked about with like used car salesmen. So what happens is you're looking at a car and they'll go, just for you, I'm going to knock off £1,000. And this is only available for right now, but if you buy this car now, I'll give you £1,000 off. And a little bit of you goes, they're doing me a favour, I'd best buy the car. Healthcare communication can be the same way. So if you are asking for something that requires another person to either modify or adapt or give you something or do something, what you need to do is reciprocate that by giving a little bit of you, by explaining why it's needed. And if you can bare your soul to somebody and you can share a little bit information wise about why you actually need what you're asking for, people are more likely to give it to you. So as an example, things like in offices, if you need things kept in a certain place, but that's mildly inconvenient for the person sat next to you, and you don't tell them why you need it in that place, their gut response is to be defensive about it. And then you get defensive about it because you need it, but for them it's a preference. But they don't know that you need it. They see it the other way around, as you being defensive and you wanting things a certain way, even if it inconveniences them. So if you trust them with the reasons why you need things to be done a certain way, what happens is that actually they go, oh, thank you for sharing that with me. That's very open and honest of you. I can appreciate why you need this now. And then you're more likely to get the support back.
It comes back to people aren't mind readers.
No, yeah. And it's not fair. You shouldn't have to bare your soul and talk about your private medical stuff in your office. But it does help if you're in a situation where they just don't get why something is so important to you when it seems so kind of insignificant to them.
Yeah, and I think kind of having a conversation about how to deal with kind of long-term health conditions in a work context is a whole other long thing in and of itself that I do not think we have time to get into today. But I think as well, I was having a conversation with a friend once and she was supported. I was having a hard time. I was just talking to her and I said, thank you for talking to me, she's, don't say thank you, it's fine, like that's what friends are for. And I said, no, but I still do think that it's important to like let people know that you're grateful for them being there for you. So it's not saying like, oh, they're doing me a huge favor because I'm such a burden and da 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 da. But I think it's still kind of being a decent human being and not expecting. So you know, I don't have to do the things that I do for the people in my life. I do it because I want to do it.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing the other way around. And I think we also have to recognize that the people in our lives also have agency, and that there might be reasons why they can't help us with certain things, or they might not understand things. And that can be really, really hard. And I'm not talking about people who are in really abusive and terrible situations, but I think we also have to recognize that there are going to be people that just do not understand. And it might take them a while, because unless you live with it, you don't get it. Or I think that it can be, I'm a big fan of communication, and I think it's and trying to learn to recognize that other people are coming from another place. And I do find that really hard sometimes, not even just in terms of my own issues, but you know, when you're trying to support other people, when they approach things in a completely opposite way to you, you're like, why would you do that in your head? But you can't say that to them, right? And I think it all comes back to, we all have completely different coping strategies, and kind of learning to figure out what yours are, and being able to communicate that. And just very quickly, like in a work context, the way that I have been framing it comes back to how I frame it in relationships. Like this is what I can offer. This is my deal, and in order to be the best to me that I can be, these are the things I need to do, and here's how you can do that. But if you know, there are things in place, there's access to work schemes, there's a lot of HR departments have accessibility teams, or they can bring in somebody to do assessments, or someone like Jo has myriad tips for how to manage those things. So and there's so much amazing information online these days that just was not available when I was younger. And so I think kind of, yeah, sorry, I'm a bit dehydrated now. But there's all these things that I think we constantly have to think about. So it's taking, again, one step at a time, and figuring out what we need for ourselves, and then how we can be there for other people as well.
Definitely. I think language does have power as well. The way we talk about ourselves and our needs does change how we feel about them. So one of the changes I made last year was to stop apologizing for things I have no control over.
Mm-hmm.
So with work, if it took me a couple of weeks or even months to get back to somebody with a work email, bear in mind it's just me, you know, so if I'm off sick, everyone's off sick. Like, that's it, there's no more office. I would always start with, I'm sorry it took me so long to get back to you, but actually that was unavoidable, and it was in my best interests to take that time to get better so that I could do my job afterwards. So now I've started with, thank you for your patience. And it's completely changed how I feel about my waiting times and how I feel about my responses to things.
And you have an
grateful rather than feel guilty.
But you also have an auto response, and you have a signature. I have it in my signature that says, you know, it may take me longer to get back to you. And so people then are not going to be sending you angry follow-up emails because you've already set that boundary in advance. Which is super helpful. I think one other thing that we haven't really touched on that I think might be really helpful is aids and things that you can use to adapt stuff. And I think one of the nice things about general energy management is that it doesn't necessarily have to cost anything. However, buying aids and tools and things to help around the house can become very expensive. So I think, for example, I got a wrist support that came with a keyboard support, and I find it really hard to sit at this table, and I'm just using it to kind of support me while I'm sitting here, and it's like the most comfortable thing for my Zoom calls that I've done in a long time. So I'm glad I've got that. But when we're talking about kind of aids and support, what does that mean in a pacing context, or in terms of things that can help people? Because it's such a broad topic. So how can we start?
Definitely. I think about things that we've talked about so far, the kind of strategies is like level 1 in adaptation. And then I normally, after all that stuff's in place, just sit and actually, from a reviewing perspective, what's left that's still really, really difficult? I've adapted, I've learned skills, I've modified, I'm taking breaks, I'm better hydrated. What is it in my life that is still next to impossible or still makes me unwell? And then those are the things you start looking for the next bit with. So from a pacing perspective, things like mobility aids can save you a vast amount of energy, particularly if you've got the ability to sit down. So if I'm leaving the house and I know I might be queuing, or if I've got stuff to carry, or if I don't know where the benches are and I know the benches are too far apart, I'll always have a mobility aid I can sit down on. Whether that's my wheelchair or whether that's a rollator, I have something where I can just take a seat, take the weight off a little bit, have a bit of a rest, and then carry on.
Rollators are a game changer, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh
Right?
my gosh, I had not tried one until about a year ago. And I think especially if you're building up walking again,
Yeah.
even just being able to sit, and again, this comes back down to pacing, even sitting down for like 1, 2, 3 minutes, the difference that makes is so substantial.
Yeah. Particularly for standing up. So a lot of people find walking is one thing, standing in a checkout queue is entirely another. So being able to sit down once you've loaded your conveyor belt with stuff often means that you've recovered enough post shopping that you can actually load the bags afterwards without feeling like you're about to fall asleep. So yeah, mobility aids can be fantastic for that, but equally things like voice dictation software or an ergonomic keyboard so that everything isn't quite such a struggle. Food processors can be fantastic. Having things that chop up and grate veg for you means that food prep is considerably easier. And what's left afterwards is maybe a bit more washing up, but actually that's a separate task. And you can have a break before you have to tackle that. So it does mean that you can kind of speed up the process a little bit. It's equally worth considering your priorities. So walking is something that I am not well designed for. The combination of conditions I have, along with kind of skeletal, I've got hip dysplasia as well as hip instability, which basically means that if I walk, I pick up tendinopathy or bursitis in both hips in a very short period of time. That then means I can't sleep, which then makes my POTS worse, which then causes a fatigue flare, which means that I end up completely nocturnal entirely by accident, all because I tried to walk around Sainsbury's. So what I've done is to look at the priorities in my life and look at the things that are a problem. And I said, well, actually, walking is not something I'm good at. Exercise doesn't have to be walking. So I now use mobility aids when I'm leaving the house much more often, and then spend more time in the house dancing, doing Pilates, bit of yoga, resistance bands. The garage has been converted into a gym. Gardening is great exercise. All of these things are better for me than walking. So I've shifted my priorities around and my perspective and just gone, actually, from a risk reward analysis point of view, if I use a mobility aid around B&Q, I've then got energy for something else later on. So I'm distributing my energy more effectively.
And something that we've talked about before when we're talking about kind of exercise, it could be really helpful to reframe this as movement. And I've done a whole series on this because, again, going back to this, if you've been in bed for months because of fatigue, if someone tells you to exercise, you're going to say something very rude to them. Because if you've not been able to get up, right, how are you supposed to go and exercise? So kind of reframing exercise as anything that you do to move. Even, being conscious of your posture while you're on the loo, right? Like, can you integrate these things into your day-to-day life in really tiny ways as you build up? Is really important. And something that you've said to me, for example, about physiotherapy is, say your physio has told you to do 10 reps of something. You don't have to do them all in one go. You could do 3 in the, this is going to be bad maths, 10 doesn't divide into 3. Say you're meant to do 9 things. You could do 3 in the morning, 3 in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening, if that is a better way for you to manage your energy throughout the day. And so I think, again, with like a lot of activities, we think this is my time to do X activity, when actually we can kind of break these things down even more throughout the day. So you talked about reading, for example. I was like a competitive reader. And I would just want to finish everything and read and read and read and read. Whereas I'm trying now, instead of going on my phone, to pick up a book for like a minute. You know, if Sebastian goes to the loo while we're watching something on TV, I'm trying to get into the habit of being okay to just read for a minute, and that is still reading, and that still is something that I love to do, and I'm still doing it. And that might be the only time that I've read that day, because I'm tired and it's easier to just scroll on the internet and just stare at a screen. But I don't feel good doing that. And so that kind of thinking about how pacing can apply can work in so many different ways.
The exercise example is a really good one. Like, I also think we as humans have this weird kind of hierarchy of movement in our brains. Like, you have to be able to crawl, and then you can walk, and then you can speed walk, and then you can jog, and then after jogging you're allowed to do fun things like swimming and Zumba and rock climbing. That's not how it has to be, you know. Although I'm not, you know, a rock climbing instructor anymore, a couple of times a year I do try to make it to a climbing wall. I will go in my wheelchair, because the things that were challenging were getting there in the first place. So I've solved the commute problem. And then actually, when you're doing the rope work side of the climbing experience, that's normally stood still. I couldn't do that anymore. So I'll sit down for the rope work, climb, come back down, lay on the floor and recover, and then sit for the rope work. You can modify how you do things. Not being good at walking does not mean you cannot exercise. And by exercise, all I mean is exertion of some kind. So like you were saying about sitting on the loo, perfect posture peeing is a thing I recommend on a regular basis. So every time you go to the loo, try to sit there unsupported, using the right muscles, and just practice sitting upright. And then after a while, you get to the point where you can sit upright doing things. So now, intermittently, whenever I do webinars or presentations, I'll spend a little bit of time sat up and talking. But it took me time to build up to that. To start with, sitting up straight or talking were my options. Building up on that, I'm now getting better at doing both, but not for too long.
Somebody that I interviewed once said that, you know, she went from being bedbound to being able to work at her desk, and she did it in 2-minute increments a couple of times a day, and she built it up that much. And I think we often really underestimate how much we need to break an activity down. And it's the same when we're having a flare up. Like, just because you might have been able to do something on some of your better days, it doesn't mean that you can't do it at all. It's probably that you set what you're asking of yourself too high. And I think that's often the case with so many activities, is that we're trying to do a higher level of what we're able to do at that point, but because we can't do it, we feel like we failed, when actually it could just be the need for it to adapt it a bit more, which is, again, it takes time. But I think a lot of people are really surprised when you kind of talk about how much you can break things down, and how even a minute of doing something is enough to make a difference. Like, I was so surprised at how little time you could spend doing something and the impact that it could have.
It adds up. It does add up. I think particularly exercise is something where a lot of people really struggle. And I think part of the problem is that we see exercise as this block of thing that has to occur in one go.
It's a workout.
Yeah, but you don't have to do it
No.
like that. So for me, exercise is something that I do, as an example, in TV advert breaks. So if I'm watching Grey's Anatomy while live chatting with my mum, when the advert breaks come on, I'll sit on a gym ball until the program comes back on. Or I'll lay on the floor and do pelvic tilting exercises until the program comes back on. But that's it, and I'll stop. Or it may be that I'll integrate exercise into like already existing things that use energy. So calf raises, I will do stood at the sink while I brush my teeth before bed.
I do that.
Brilliant. So
sorry.
So yeah, it's so much easier when you think about what's actually involved with exercise. Often there's a getting up phase, then there's a doing the exercise bit, and then there's the kind of recovery / getting clean and dressed / whatever it is afterwards. Whereas if you're already up and about doing something else and you integrate a tiny little bit of exercise, you've not had to have a separate preparing for exercise section, and there's not a separate recovering section. because it's already part of a pre-existing structure of do thing, rest, do thing, rest.
And it gives you that small win, and it gives you that confidence. And I think sometimes that's the most important thing, because it could be the hardest thing to try and kind of make yourself do it. One of the things, there's this physio, Claire Campbell, that I work with a lot. We did my movement with chronic pain series, and she has kind of hypermobility issues, so she kind of understands it like you from a personal level. And one of the things that we talked about, I mentioned earlier, is no 0 days. And she said something really interesting to me. She'll have patients who, for example, go to work, I don't know, once a month or something. And for most of the time when they're at home, they never get dressed. They don't do all of these things that you would have to do before you go to work. So on top of having to leave the house for something that they don't often do, they're having to do all of these other things. They're showering, even if it's a day before, they're washing their hair, they're maybe putting makeup on, they're putting on clothes that are less comfortable or whatever. They're doing all these things that they so rarely do, that it's like you're asking them to do a whole other thing on top of going out. So even, for example, like I've got my pajama leggings and my socks on under my top, but I put on a nice top every day that makes me feel happy and confident. And I'll put on some lipstick or some powder, or there are small things that I do every day, and it's keeping a base level of activity. That means that if I want to try and do something else, like leave the house, these are things that I'm already doing, and that are habits for me, and that I'm used to, and I'm not asking myself to do 5 activities plus a big activity that is new. And I think that was a really interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, brilliant. This is something that I've been working with a lot of my clients who have been shielding. So that's effectively an entire year's worth of ruined routines.
Yeah.
0 access to healthcare, no social life outside of video calls. It's been a massive challenge, but these clients are now faced with actually going back to work being a massive challenge, because all of their tolerances for doing these things are now non-existent.
Yeah.
So the return to work plan actually included an entire month of homework. And that homework was things like, can you start waking up on time? Can you start having your lunch in line with when your work lunch break would actually be? Can you start actually wearing daytime clothes so that you've got the same amount of laundry on a weekly basis that you would have when you're back at work? Can you start, putting on makeup in the morning if you wear it? Or actually things like practice, like tying your shoes again. We get out of the habit of sitting down to put shoes on, and then the first time you go to leave the house, you try to zip your boots up standing up and topple yourself over in the hallway and end up injured. So it's about building up a tolerance for these things and working out where the problems lie, and then addressing any of those problems, so that you've got everything pre-modified, ready for when you actually have to go outside the house. And the outside the house bit can be practice runs to start with. So the first time you leave the house post shielding, it should not be to go to work. It should be to actually drive the route to work, take your car around the corner if you've not driven for a while, go to the corner shop and actually, so really silly things like I was quite careful for a lot of, I wasn't shielding, but was kind of borderline, maybe should have got a letter if somebody had actually read my notes, but we'll see how it goes. But the first time I went to B&Q again, I was completely visually overwhelmed, because there were all these new arrows and signs and directions, and it was a one-way system. Everybody else had had months to learn how all this worked. Whereas when I got there, I was just like, this is ridiculous. I can't do it. Like, I need somebody to physically lead me around the shop. And I just could not navigate all of this new information. So practicing all of this stuff before you then start adding in difficult jobs is a really, really important thing to do. I've since realized that actually when I don't know the one-way system for things, and like there's too many signs involved, I've got like a guide cane white stick for nighttime use because my night vision is awful. I've started using it in the daytime because it allows me to not look at my feet when I'm walking, so that I can spot all the arrows in advance rather than having to split my attention. But yeah, so there is kind of the extra stuff does need considering, and practicing stuff is totally a sensible thing to do.
Yeah, and it kind of comes back to a lot of the things that have popped up throughout this conversation in terms of building habits and really starting as small as you need to, and having plans, and thinking about these things as holistically as possible. And I think one of the things that I know we have to wrap up in a few minutes, but like one of the things that the first things you said to me is you never claim that pacing is going to cure anyone, right? It's not a quick fix. It's not the answer to your chronic illness. What is it, if we're going to sum it up?
It's the start of a routine that allows you some control back over your life. I think, it's the start of making a life that works for you, regardless of how different that is from what you envisioned your dream life would be.
And that you deserve to have that. I think it's a really important thing for people to remember. I think especially if you've been really medicalized for so long, just thinking about the things that you want to do and the things that you love to do always take a can't think of words now, back seat. And if there's anything I want people to take away from this, is that you can start as small as you need to, and every time you have a flare up, you can go back to starting as small as you need to. And pacing doesn't mean that you're not going to have hard times and that you're not going to be upset about things. I get upset about things. You get upset about a lot. I think it's very cathartic to get upset about things.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, is there anything kind of you wanted to say before we kind of wrap up?
I think there was just one question about using heart rate monitors for pacing.
Ah, yes.
I vaguely recall that. I think we've covered all the other topics, but yeah, so there was a pre-asked question about using heart rate readings for pace by. So this is a relatively new theory that's staying within kind of maximum and minimum heart rate values allows you to never push the kind of energy envelope into you exerting yourself, so you don't then get that kind of post-exertional malaise payback type thing. It's an interesting theory, but one thing there are a couple of things I'd caution people about if they want to try this. The first one is that a lot of us, particularly if you've been in bed a lot or if you've got pre-existing kind of autonomic wonkinesses, will develop something called orthostatic intolerance, which is basically your body no longer tolerates being upright as well as it should do. What this can do is put your heart rate, blood pressure, other kind of autonomic systems a little bit out of whack. So as an example, my resting heart rate is about 68 beats per minute. My heart rate when I'm talking is about 100. My heart rate if I'm standing is about 120. My heart rate if I'm French plaiting my hair standing up is about 145. That doesn't mean I can't braid my hair. It just means that I need to do it sat down. So one of the things we need to be aware of if we're looking at like actual like kind of numbers readings for things is that sometimes those numbers aren't representative of the amount of energy we're using, but rather it's just a reading of how wonky our body systems are at the time of recording. That said, it can be a useful way to spot trends. So I've learned things like actually shampooing my hair makes me really tachycardic. So I don't wash my hair unless I'm in the bath sat down. So, things like that. If we start spotting patterns, like me working out that I need to sit down to braid my hair because having my arms above my head is problematic. But equally, it can allow you to spot things like illnesses. So I can sometimes predict if I'm coming down with a cold because my heart rate readings will be higher for 2 days beforehand. So, things like that. Sometimes we can't necessarily trust our numbers in terms of how much exertion is actually occurring, and it's best to go by gut feeling more than anything else. The other thing is it's really easy to get obsessed with those numbers.
I was just going to say about that.
Yeah, somebody else said it in the comments as well, that it is really tempting to start looking at numbers, and every time there's a blip, every time there's an exertion, every time there's anything, is this a sign of illness? Am I getting fitter? Am I not? Really worrying about keeping yourself within those numbers. And actually, if you're only above it for like 3 beats, 3 heartbeats, is that really worth worrying over? Probably not. So I don't wear a heart rate monitor all the time. I will wear one if I'm feeling unwell and I need to work out what these new triggers are to being unwell. or if I'm doing something that I know is pushing the envelope a little bit, pushing my energy levels, like going for a walk. So in terms of like readings and actual monitoring stuff, use them if you feel they're useful, but don't feel like it's something you have to use all of the time. You can use it to train yourself to understand what your body feels like. So I have, for a very, very long time, when I first developed postural tachycardia, really struggled to recognize what tachycardia felt like. So I would have really alarmingly high heart rates when exercising and feel fine. And then afterwards, the crash would be epic and it was awful. So I started using watches that give off alerts at different heart rate readings to train me to, when I was tachycardic, just sit with it and work out what it felt like and understand what my body was doing. And now I can do it without the watch. So from that perspective, it can be a useful thing to do, but the anxiety and obsession that comes along with it needs to be something you're aware of and manage as you go.
Oh, something's gone. My internet is unstable. I think you stopped talking. I tried using a heart rate monitor for a few days and I hated it. Again, like I'm a person that's very aware and able to be aware of what my body is doing at certain times. So I think, a lot of people even just find doing short-term diaries helpful and thinking about what their symptoms are and what their symptoms are at different times. And I think one thing we didn't talk about that I'll really briefly mention is learning what is normal for you. So something that might feel like a really alarming symptom, especially if it's new, will be really, really hard to deal with. But if you know that is something that is normal and expected, you know how to deal with it. You know that you're safe. You know that it's just kind of an uncomfortable, unpleasant thing that happens to your body, but it's just your deal. And I think that plays a really big role in pacing because it helps you be able to understand what your body is doing as you're trying to figure out your activity levels.
Definitely. It's also worth keeping in mind that your normal right now is not the same as your normal in 6 months' time.
Mm-hmm.
Seasonal normal is also a thing.
Oh God, it really is.
Particularly for anyone with heat intolerance, what you are capable of in the middle of winter will be radically different to what you are capable of in the middle of July during a heat wave. It's okay to have like summer and winter normal and spring and summer, the changes and the transitions. It'll probably catch you out the first couple of times the weather changes, but you do settle into routines. But yeah, it's totally okay to plan for different scenarios that are weather-based or seasonal or natural cycles within your conditions. It's okay to have varying strategies. In fact, I would encourage it. It's sensible to have varying strategies for different things that your body and mind need.
And basically what it comes down to is that over time you will have developed the biggest bloody toolbox of coping strategies that will touch everything in your life. You'll have all of these things in the kitchen that will have been adapted, all of these things when you're working, all of these things for how you walk around the house, how you do everything. And at the end of the day, a lot of the time they'll have become so normal to you and the people around you that you'll stop thinking about them as these are the adaptations that I have to do to manage my condition. They are just part of my normal. And I think that is something, again, that you can build up to. And it takes experimentation and it takes time. You can play around with things and test things out. And as Jo said, what works for you at one time might not work at another. And it's kind of developing this almost master list of things that you can pull from when you need them. And I think it's Jo changed my life, so thank you very much, Jo. I think Jo is amazing. But yeah, I don't know kind of if what we should do now, if anyone wants to jump in.
I was just going to say, well, first of all, thank you. Sorry, this squeaks, so apologies if you can hear that. Thank you so much to both of you. I know that like spending 2 hours on a Saturday and having to rest probably before and after is a really big commitment. So thank you both for coming along to this, and thank you to everyone else for turning up. I will, on a practical note, once I've had a rest, I've kind of kept a rough kind of chronological order of like the topics we've talked about. So I will send out a link to this recording that I will make free for like the next, like maybe till the end of next weekend. So if you want to watch it again, or like want to watch a section, I haven't like done it with specific timings, but you'll know roughly where to look as you kind of scroll through. If you want to watch a section again or watch the whole thing again, then I'll send an email out later today or tomorrow. And then after that, it will be available permanently on our Patreon, where we have recordings of all of our workshops. So if you sign up to that, you'll be able to watch all of our workshops if you so desire. So that, just on a really practical note, that will be heading into your inboxes. My emails sometimes do go into your spam. I don't know why, just have a habit of doing that. Something about Chronically Awesome, spam bots hate. So if you don't get something, just check there. But yeah, thank you everyone for your engagement and for your questions as well. If you do have like any really pressing follow-up questions, I'll also in the email include Jo and Natasha's like social media tags and that sort of thing. I'm sure they'll be happy to kind of answer follow-up questions and stuff via their social media and respective websites and that sort of thing. I'm probably not the best person to ask because I'm not the expert on these things. It's been educational for me too. So yeah, thank you so much everyone, and enjoy a restful rest of your weekend.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, hope it was really useful. Take care, guys. Good luck with your pacing.
Bye.
Yes. Bye.
Bye.